She buried her husband under gray skies, surrounded by family, grief, and silence. But as the prayers began, a young pregnant woman stepped forward, laid her hand on the coffin, and whispered a single word that froze the room. Asterisk Daddy. Asterisk what followed shattered everything Margaret thought she knew. Secrets hidden in letters, photographs, and receipts, a child born into scandal, and a family torn apart by betrayal. But in the end, Margaret faced a choice no one expected. Deny the child forever or claim him as her own blood. What would you have done? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The morning broke heavy with clouds, the kind that seemed to smother even the faintest promise of sunlight. The air was damp and cool, carrying away the season not yet settled, a season caught between fall's last colors and winter's looming gray. At the churchyard gates, cars arrived in hesitant procession, their doors opening to release men and women dressed in black, their footsteps muted on the wet ground. They moved together but did not speak much, their eyes lowered, their voices hushed as though the air itself demanded reverence. Inside the chapel, the scent of lilies and polish would mingle with something older, the faint musk of hymnals untouched for years. The casket rested at the front, polished mahogany under a cross of white roses. Its lid remained closed, not by choice but by necessity, and the silence around it carried an edge sharper than grief. Margaret Hale sat nearest to it, her black-gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her posture rigid against the weight pressing in from all sides. Her veil fell just enough to soften her face from the view of others, though anyone who looked closely would see that her eyes had not yet blinked away the shock of the past week. Thomas had been 53 when the sudden heart attack carried him away, a man whose presence had always seemed too strong to be cut down so quickly. Margaret had stood beside him through 3 decades, through the careful construction of a life that now seemed more fragile than she had ever realized. Their children, grown but not far removed from the struggles of independence, sat on either side of her. David shifted in his seat every few moments, jaw tight, fists curling, the loss sitting on him like a storm he had no words for. Clara, younger, leaned forward slightly, her face pale, lips pressed into a line as though even the act of breathing too loudly would betray her composure. The pews filled steadily as neighbors, colleagues, and distant relatives filed in. The murmurs of sympathy floated toward Margaret in fragments. Such a kind man, taken too soon, unimaginable loss. Each phrase landed on her ears without weight, as if they were meant for someone else. She nodded when required, her face unmoving, her body a statue carved from grief and disbelief. The organ began its first low notes, a sound that rose from the floorboards and spread through space until it filled every corner. Heads bowed, hands folded, and the minister stepped forward, his worn Bible balanced carefully in his palms. He began to speak of life and death, of Thomas's years of service to the community, of the legacy left behind. But Margaret's gaze never left the casket. Her mind wandered to small, ordinary moments. His hand on the back of her chair at dinner, the smell of his cologne lingering in their hallway, the sound of his voice when he read the newspaper aloud though no one asked him to. These fragments surfaced unbidden, piercing her like splinters, and she wondered how memory could feel both comforting and cruel in the same breath. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the tall stained-glass windows, a rhythm that seemed to mark time in place of clock. Margaret felt the eyes of the congregation shift toward her, as if every guest was measuring her composure, waiting to see if the widow would falter. But she did not move. She sat with her grief locked tightly inside her chest, refusing to let it spill where others could see. Her only motion was the faint tightening of her fingers over one another, pressing to the thin leather of her gloves. The minister's voice rose in prayer, and the crowd followed with whispered amens. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, not in devotion but in a small attempt to steady herself. She thought of how Thomas had always hated long ceremonies, how he would have shifted impatiently in his seat, muttering later about wasted time. The irony of his own funeral dragging on struck her, but no smile came, only another reminder of his absence. When she opened her eyes, the world around her seemed unchanged, rows of bowed heads, the casket at arm's reach, the weight of loss pressing the air flat. Yet somewhere in the stillness, Margaret sensed the day had only begun to test her. Grief was one burden, but beneath it lay something unnamed waiting to surface. And though she did not yet know it, before the service ended, her mourning would no longer be her own. The chapel had settled into the rhythm of mourning. The minister's voice carried through the vaulted space with measured weight, his words practiced but sincere, filling the silences between the occasional cough or the rustle of tissues. Margaret kept her eyes fixed forward, staring past the polished wood of the casket, as if willing herself not to think, not to feel, not to remember anything but the fact that this moment was hers and hers alone. The organ had fallen quiet, and in that stillness the grief of the congregation seemed to hang heavy in the air, shared but unspoken. Then the doors at the back of the chapel creaked open, the sound loud enough to turn heads in the first few rows. A gust of damp air swept inside, carrying with the scent of rain and the faint clatter of hurried steps. People shifted in their seats, glancing back, their expressions flickering from irritation at the interruption to confusion at the sight of the young woman who entered. She moved with a hesitance that was almost defiant, her hand supporting the swell of her stomach, her dress plain but neat, hair dampened by the weather outside. The murmurs began as a faint stir, like wind moving through leaves, growing louder as recognition, or the lack of it, spread from one pew to the next. Strangers were not unusual at funerals. Colleagues or acquaintances sometimes appeared quietly, but this was different. Every detail about her presence demanded attention, from the fullness of her pregnancy to the fact that she walked straight down the aisle with her head lifted, as if she had a rightful place among the front rows. Margaret heard the whispers before she saw the cause. She turned slowly, her eyes following the subtle shift of the congregation until they landed on the woman approaching the casket. The sight struck her like a sudden blow. This girl, young enough to be her daughter, her belly round with imminent life, did not hesitate. She reached the coffin and laid her hand gently on its surface, fingers trembling but steady enough to show intent. The chapel hushed in anticipation, and the moment stretched until her words broke it apart. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft yet carrying with uncanny clarity through the quiet room. The word lingered in the air, heavier than the toll of any bell. Gasps echoed, some sharp, some whispered, while others stared wide-eyed, waiting for an explanation that did not come. Margaret felt her chest tighten. Her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. Her gloved hands clenched the edge of her seat, but her body refused to move. It was as though she had been turned to stone, her grief interrupted by something rawer, stranger, and far more dangerous. The minister froze mid-gesture, his Bible lowering slightly as he looked down at the young woman with uncertainty. No one moved to stop her. No usher stepped forward to escort her away. The congregation seemed held captive by the shock, watching her hand linger on the coffin as if she were tethered to it. Margaret could hear the voices around her now, fragments of speculation breaking through the tension. Who is she? Did she say pregnant? Impossible. The words swirled like smoke, wrapping around her until she felt dizzy. Her children shifted beside her, David leaning forward as though to rise, Clara whispering something frantic that Margaret could not hear over the pounding in her ears. The girl's eyes glistened as she looked at the casket, her lips trembling but her chin raised. She did not look at Margaret, did not acknowledge the widow or the children, as though her connection was only with a man lying silent inside. The intimacy of her gesture, the audacity of the single word she had spoken, tore through the sanctuary more completely than any sermon could. Margaret tried to summon denial, to tell herself this was a mistake, a cruel intrusion by someone confused or malicious. But the stillness of the girl's hand, the way she rested it gently as though she had done so before, suggested otherwise. The truth was not yet spoken in detail, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and as Margaret sat rigid in her pew, the eyes of the congregation shifted from the girl to her, searching her face for reaction, for confirmation, for scandal. The minister cleared his throat, stammering over the words he had prepared, unable to continue. A silence deeper than prayer filled the chapel, and in that silence Margaret understood that the funeral she had thought would mark an end had just become the beginning of something else entirely. The coffin, once a symbol of closure, now felt like the door to secrets she had never imagined would be open in front of so many witnesses. And though she tried to hold herself steady, Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her, as if grief alone had not been enough. For a moment, Margaret could not tell if she was breathing. The sound of the young woman's voice still rang in her ears, sharp as glass, and everything else seemed to dissolve. The murmurs in the chapel, the steady dripping of rain against the stained glass windows, the faint smell of lilies, each sensation blurred and thinned until it was only that one word, spoken with such unsettling certainty. "Daddy." She felt the weight of 100 eyes slide away from the coffin and settle on her. It was as though the entire room had turned in unison, measuring her silence, searching her face for an answer she had not yet formed. The widow who had carried herself with quiet dignity since the morning was no longer the center of pity. She was the object of scrutiny. Margaret Hale, devoted wife of 30 years, sat exposed under the heavy gaze of relatives, neighbors, and strangers who all wanted to see if she would break. Her hands, still folded in her lap, tightened until her knuckles whitened beneath the gloves. She forced her eyes forward, refusing to look at the young woman whose hand remained pressed against the coffin. If she looked, if she acknowledged her presence, she feared something inside her would unravel beyond repair. Her children sat tense at her sides, David shifting uncomfortably, Clara leaning slightly toward her mother as if to offer support or demand explanation. Margaret did not move. She sat as though frozen in stone, her face composed, her body rigid, but beneath the stillness her thoughts churned like a storm. The minister's voice faltered, his prayer broken in half. He lowered his Bible and glanced nervously between Margaret and the young woman, his authority suspended in confusion. A cough echoed from the back pew. Someone dropped a tissue box to the floor, but otherwise the chapel remained in stunned silence. Margaret knew that silence would not last. Already whispers threaded through the room, passed from lip to ear like wildfire, each version of the story reshaping itself before reaching the next listener. She tried to anchor herself in memory, to recall Thomas as she had known him, his steady laugh, the way his brow furrowed over morning coffee, the way he filled a room without effort. She wanted to hold on to that man, the one she had loved, the one whose absence now hollowed her chest. But even in her mind his image began to waver, threatened by the presence of a stranger who dared to call him father. Margaret could feel the eyes of her in-laws boring into her from the row behind. Their silence carried judgment, as though this revelation confirmed suspicions they had never voiced. Friends shifted uneasily, their glances filled with pity that now felt tainted. The betrayal was not only in the possibility of Thomas's secrets, but in the way her mourning had been stolen from her, transformed into public spectacle. She considered rising, demanding the woman leave, reclaiming her place beside the coffin as the rightful wife. But her body refused her. Something deeper than fear rooted her to the pew. She needed to understand before she acted, needed to grasp whether this was a cruel lie or a truth that had lived in shadows for years. Until then, she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. The young woman still had not looked at her. She stood with one hand on the coffin, head bowed slightly, lips moving in what might have been a whispered prayer or a private conversation with the man inside. Margaret's chest tightened at the intimacy of the gesture. It was not the act of an intruder seeking attention. It was the act of someone who believed she belonged. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, the moment refusing to release its grip. Margaret sat frozen, her heart pounding, her mind unwilling to move forward. She could not yet cry, could not yet rage. All she could do was sit in the silence, bearing the weight of every gaze in the chapel, knowing that her grief had just been transformed into something else entirely, something that would not end with the funeral. The hush that had settled over the chapel cracked slowly, not with shouts or confrontation, but with the quiet sting of whispers. They began at the edges, soft enough at first to be mistaken for the rustle of fabric or the shifting of pews, but soon they grew into a steady undercurrent, words leaking like water through stone. Margaret heard them without needing to strain, every fragment cutting through her stillness with cruel precision. "Did you hear what she said?" Someone breathed from the second row. She called him Daddy. Another answered. "Could it be true?" Came a third voice, hushed but eager. The murmurs passed quickly from pew to pew, suspicion traveling like a current no one could resist. Faces leaned close to one another, lips moving behind raised hands, eyes darting toward the coffin, and then, inevitably, to Margaret. Some tried to conceal their curiosity with solemn expressions, but most could not. The funeral had shifted in an instant from a ceremony of mourning to a stage for scandal, and the congregation, however unwilling they might claim to be, was already the audience. Margaret sat unmoving, her back straight, her chin high, though the whispers pricked at her skin like needles. She knew every syllable was a speculation about her life, her marriage, her husband. 30 years of quiet partnership, reduced to gossip in less than a minute. She had expected sorrow today, had braced herself for pity, but she had not prepared for judgment. Not here, not in front of him. Her son David tensed beside her, his jaw tightening as he caught pieces of the conversations. He leaned forward, his gaze sweeping across the rows, daring someone to say it louder. Clara shifted uncomfortably, her lips parting as though she wanted to whisper something herself but held it back. They were young enough to be wounded by what others thought, yet old enough to understand the weight of accusation. Margaret sensed their unease but could not speak to them, could not break the silence she clung to as the only defense she had left. At the back of the chapel, Thomas's brother leaned toward his wife, his voice a low murmur but sharp with disdain. Always said he was restless. Now we see the proof. His wife pursed her lips in agreement, casting a sidelong glance at Margaret as though betrayal could be read on her face. Near them, a cousin shook her head slowly, whispering that perhaps grief made the young woman confused, or worse, that she was desperate for attention. Others countered in hushed tones that the resemblance was there, in the curve of her face, in the eyes that mirrored Thomas's. Each theory gained strength in the telling, fed by the need to fill silence with certainty. The minister cleared his throat, trying to gather the congregation back to prayer, but the whispers refused to be quelled. Even as his voice rose in scripture, the murmur of speculation rippled underneath. A second voice in the room, low and insistent. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, not in devotion, but in an attempt to shut out. Yet the words pressed in, reshaping her memory of the man she had loved into something unfamiliar. When she opened her eyes again, she caught the gaze of an old friend across the aisle. The woman's expression was sympathetic, but beneath it Margaret saw something harder, doubt. That flicker of suspicion was worse than outright accusation. It was a look of someone who wanted to believe in Margaret's marriage, but could not quite silence the possibility that everything had not been as it seemed. The young woman at the coffin remained silent after her single word, her hand still resting there as though the world outside had nothing to do with her grief. She seemed untouched by the murmurs, or perhaps she was deaf to them in her certainty. To Margaret, that stillness was unbearable. Each whisper in the pews grew louder in contrast to the girl's silence, filling the space with questions Margaret herself could not answer. The service stood suspended, unable to move forward until the tension resolved, until someone reclaimed control of the room. But control was no longer in the minister's hands, nor in Margaret's. It belonged to the whispers, to the stories already being shaped, to the judgment that spread faster than truth could ever hope to catch. And as the voices tangled together in the chapel's shadows, Margaret sat frozen, knowing that whatever came next, her grief was no longer hers alone. It had been claimed by the crowd, dissected by their murmurs, and woven into a scandal that would not be buried with her husband. The minister had officiated countless funerals in his 30 years of service. He had guided families to the raw edge of grief, stood steady when others broke, and carried words like a lantern into the darkest hours of loss. Yet now, as he stood at the pulpit with his notes trembling in his hands, he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down harder than any sorrow he had known. The silence in the chapel had shifted. It was no longer the reverent hush of mourning, but silence thick with scandal, suspicion, and the sharp sting of unanswered questions. He glanced at Margaret, her face composed but rigid, her body still as though carved in marble. He saw the young woman at the coffin, her hand resting with quiet conviction on the polished wood. Between them stretched an invisible line that seemed to divide the room itself. Every eye flicked back and forth between widow and stranger, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak with authority. And yet the authority that should have belonged to him faltered. The minister tried to resume the service. He lowered his eyes to his notes, words about Thomas's life and legacy, phrases carefully chosen to bring comfort, but the paper blurred. His hand shook enough that the neat lines of ink wavered. Each sentence he had prepared now seemed naive, as though written for a man no longer present in truth. Could he praise Thomas's devotion when a young woman stood before them carrying his unborn child? Could he speak of faithfulness when doubt now shadowed every memory? His throat tightened as he attempted to speak again. We gather today in remembrance. The words cracked, thin and uncertain, falling flat into the uneasy air. A few heads bowed out of habit, but most remained lifted, eyes fixed on the spectacle at the front. The minister cleared his throat, shifting the papers in his hands, though he no longer saw the words. He felt the tremor in his fingers grow, the fragile tremble of a man suddenly aware that his role was slipping away. He searched the faces before him. He saw Thomas's siblings whispering to one another, their eyes sharp with judgment. He saw distant relatives leaning in, eager to hear each rumor as it formed. He saw Margaret's children shifting uneasily, their grief cracked open into confusion. And he saw Margaret herself, silent and still, refusing to react, though her silence seemed louder than any protest. The young woman, too, remained silent, her head bowed slightly, as though the coffin alone deserved her voice. The minister realized then that whatever words he spoke next would not only shape the service, but might also inflame or pacify the crowd. His role as spiritual guide had turned into something more dangerous. He was no longer speaking only to the grieving. He was speaking to witnesses, to judges, to skeptics waiting to twist his words into proof for whichever version of truth they chose to believe. The silence deepened as he hesitated. He could feel the weight of his collar pressing against his neck, suddenly heavy, suddenly suffocating. He prayed for clarity in the space between breaths, but none came. His notes trembled once more in his hands, their words foreign and useless. The sound of paper rustling seemed almost scandalous in the still air. Finally, he set the papers down on the pulpit, his palms flat against the wood as he steadied himself. "We are gathered here," he began again, slower this time, "to honor a man whose life, like all of ours, was complex, known to some in ways was not known to others. The words were not in his notes, yet they came because silence had demanded something new. A few murmurs rose in response, some approving, some doubtful, but he pressed on. It is not for us to weigh every secret, nor to understand every path taken. It is for us to grieve, to seek comfort, and to remember that even in uncertainty, we are called compassion." His voice wavered, but did not break. He clung to the words as if they were a rope in a storm. Whether they offered comfort or not, they at least offered direction, and that was what the room lacked most. Still, he knew the service had been broken in a way it could never be mended. The young woman's voice, that single word, had reshaped the day, and all he could do was stumble forward, praying that dignity might still be salvaged and the wreckage of truth left unspoken. The minister looked once more at Margaret, her face still unreadable. He looked at the girl by the coffin, her hand unmoved, and with his notes abandoned, his voice uncertain, he pressed on with the only thing he could give, the fragile semblance of ceremony, though the meaning of the moment had already slipped beyond his reach. The air inside the chapel seemed caught in suspension, as though the walls themselves held their breath. The minister's words had faltered into uneasy silence, and the congregation sat rigid, each person straining to hear what would come next. The young woman at the coffin, her hand still resting against the polished wood, finally lifted her head. Her lips parted slowly, her eyes glassy but determined, and when she spoke, her voice carried with a clarity that cut through the tension like a blade. "My name is Anna," she said. The sound echoed lightly, as though the very beams of the church bent forward to listen. Heads shifted, shoulders stiffened, and the whispers that had been swelling moments earlier fell away into startled quiet. "Thomas Hale was the father of my child." Her hand pressed gently over her rounded stomach, the movement deliberate, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Margaret felt the words strike like stones thrown into still water. The ripples of shock spread instantly through the pews. Someone gasped near the front, sharp and disbelieving. A woman in the back clutched her husband's arm and muttered something under her breath. But Anna did not waver. She stood in her plain dress, damp from the rain, her hair clinging slightly to her temples, and she spoke with steadiness that suggested she had rehearsed these words 100 times in the quiet of her small room before daring to voice them here. "He told me, Anna continued, her gaze sweeping the room though never quite meeting Margaret's, that he would take care of us, that no matter what happened, this child would not be without a father. He promised he would be there. Her voice wavered only at the end, as though grief mingled with determination had finally caught in her throat. She pressed her lips together, forcing herself to remain composed. The silence that followed was jagged, broken only by murmurs swelling once more into every corner of the chapel. "It can't be true," someone whispered. "She's lying for money," another hissed. Others exchanged glances, the kind that carried both skepticism and intrigue, as if each person wanted to be the first to decide what story to believe. Anna lowered her eyes briefly, her fingers tracing the edge of the coffin, as though drawing strength from the man inside. "I know how this must look to all of you," she said softly. "I know I shouldn't be here, not like this, but I couldn't let him be buried without the truth being spoken. My child deserves to be recognized." Margaret sat perfectly still, though every muscle in her body felt locked in tension. The words hammered against her composure, demanding reaction, demanding denial or fury, but none came. She stared at Anna as though an apparition, part of her mind insisting this was impossible, another part unwilling to dismiss the conviction in the young woman's tone. Her son David shifted beside her, his fists clenching. Clara's breath caught audibly, her hand rising to her mouth in disbelief. The minister stood frozen at the pulpit, his fingers tight around the edges of his abandoned notes. The congregation watched with the eagerness of witnesses to a spectacle they could not look away from, their grief giving way to curiosity, to judgment, to hunger for scandal. Anna's voice softened, but her words carried even more weight. "He told me he loved me. He told me I was not alone." She paused, her hand pressing again against her stomach. "And I believe him. I still do." The words fell like stones into the silence, and the air seemed to grow heavier with their presence. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the collective anticipation of everyone waiting for her to speak, to rise, to confront the woman who had just laid claim to her husband's memory. But she remained still, her grief frozen beneath a fresh layer of disbelief, her silence the only shield she had left. Anna stood quietly now, her declaration made, her presence impossible to ignore. The chapel was no longer a sanctuary of mourning but a courtroom of whispers, and Margaret knew the trial had only just begun. The stillness that followed Anna's words was brief, no more than a few heartbeats before it fractured under the weight of indignation. From the third pew on the left, Thomas's eldest sister, Eleanor, rose with a sharpness that startled those seated around her. She was a woman who carried herself with authority in every setting, her gray hair pinned neatly, her black dress as precise as her voice. "This is outrageous," she declared, her tone trembling with restrained fury. "You come into this sacred place, in the middle of his funeral, and dare to speak such lies?" The congregation shifted uneasily, torn between sympathy for Eleanor's anger and curiosity about Anna's claim. Anna herself did not flinch. She kept her hand on the coffin, her other hand resting protectively over her stomach, her chin lifted though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Eleanor's words lashed at her, but she stood her ground. Thomas's younger brother, Richard, rose next. His face was flushed, his voice harsh with scorn. "This is nothing more than an attempt to steal what isn't yours. Everyone here can see it. You wait until he's gone, until he can't defend himself, and then you appear with a story? How convenient." His words dripped with contempt, and he gestured sharply toward Anna's stomach. "How do we even know whose child that is? For all we know, you've invented this to claim a piece of his estate." The accusation spread to the pews like a spark to dry tinder. Murmurs erupted, some agreeing with Richard's blunt assessment, others whispering doubts, and still others shaking their heads at the cruelty of such words spoken so loudly in a house of worship. The minister attempted to raise a calming hand, but his presence had already been diminished. Authority belonged now to the clash between family and stranger. Anna's lips parted, her voice unsteady but firm. "I did not come here for money," she said, her words carrying the strain of someone already judged before she could speak. "I came because he promised me he would be part of this child's life, because I couldn't let him be buried without acknowledging us." Her voice broke slightly at the end, but her resolve remained. Eleanor shook her head, her voice rising further. "Nonsense. My brother was many things, but he was not a man who would betray his family like this. You shame yourself with these lies, girl, and you shame him by speaking them here, now, before his wife and children." She glanced at Margaret, as though expecting the widow to rise and join the condemnation. But Margaret sat unmoving, her silence heavy, her eyes fixed on Anna with a mix of disbelief and something darker, something that made Eleanor falter for a moment before regaining her fire. Richard pressed forward, stepping into the aisle, his anger unrestrained. "If you think this little performance will win you sympathy, you are mistaken. The Hales have weathered scandal before, and we will weather it again, but you will not disgrace our name for profit." His words rang harshly against the chapel walls, each syllable an attempt to drown out the possibility that Anna's claim might hold any truth. The congregation shifted again, caught between outrage and unease. Some nodded in agreement, comforted by Richard's certainty. Others exchanged wary glances, their curiosity undimmed. And a few stared at Margaret, waiting for her reaction, wondering why the widow did not rise to defend her husband's memory. Anna's hand trembled slightly on the coffin, but she did not retreat. Her eyes, wide and vulnerable, darted briefly toward Margaret as if seeking recognition, or perhaps forgiveness. Then she turned back to Thomas's siblings. "You can hate me if you want," she said softly. "You can call me a liar, call me whatever names you choose. But this child is his, and nothing you say will change that." Her words dropped into the room like stones into a pond, rippling outward in waves of shock, disbelief, and whispered fury. Richard's mouth opened as though to retort, but no words came. Eleanor's face flushed crimson, her hands shaking at her sides. The tension pressed down on the chapel until it felt suffocating, every breath heavy with judgment. Through it all, Margaret remained still, her silence louder than the accusations, her composure a fragile mask over the storm rising within her. The family's outrage had filled the room, but the truth or the suspicion of it still hovered, unshaken, in the figure of the young woman who refused to leave the side of the coffin. Margaret remained seated, her spine straight against the hardwood of the pew, her hands still folded in her lap. Around her, the chapel had erupted into a storm of whispers, accusations, and muffled outrage, but she heard it all as though from a distance. The voices of Thomas's siblings, sharp with fury, cut through the air, demanding that the young woman leave, condemning her as an opportunist. Yet Margaret's lips did not part. Her eyes, shielded by the thin veil that draped across her face, did not move to Anna, nor to Eleanor and Richard, nor even to the restless congregation. They remained fixed on the coffin. She searched its polished surface as though it might yield answers, as though within that carved mahogany lay not only her husband's body, but the truth of who he had been. She tried to call up the man she had known, to test Anna's words against 30 years of marriage, but her memories, once so steady, now felt like shifting sand. She remembered the evenings Thomas had returned late from work, carrying excuses about meetings that had run long or clients that required attention. She remembered the trips he had taken, always described as necessary, always hurried, often leaving her to manage the household alone. She remembered the unexpected gifts, a necklace on a Tuesday, a bouquet on an ordinary afternoon, that she had accepted as tokens of affection but now, in this new light, threatened to take on different meaning. Each recollection rose before her like a ghost, and she could not dismiss them as easily as she wished. She wanted to believe Eleanor, to cling to the certainty with which Thomas's sister had denounced the claim. She wanted to trust Richard's outrage, to see it as proof that the accusation was impossible. But something in her chest resisted. Something whispered that denial alone could not erase the possibility of betrayal. Her children sat close, their grief now unsettled by confusion. David's fists clenched and unclenched at his sides, his body tense, waiting for her to rise and strike down the intruder a word sharp enough to end the spectacle. Clara leaned toward her, whispering her name softly, as though urging her to respond, to take control before others shaped the narrative for her. But Margaret did not move. She let the silence envelop her, her stillness becoming both shield and prison. The coffin held her gaze, and she thought of Thomas's smile, the way it had reached his eyes when he was young, when their lives were simpler and full of promises. She thought of his hand steadying hers when they signed the deed to their first home, of the nights they stayed up late planning futures for their children. She thought of the way he had looked at her across crowded rooms, sometimes tired, sometimes distracted, but always hers. And yet now, she could not stop the images of absence from intruding. The empty chair at dinners, the phone calls taken in hushed tones, the explanations that once satisfied her because she had never questioned them. Was Anna's voice the echo of truth long buried? Or was it a cruel performance staged to fracture her family at its weakest point? Margaret did not know. She only knew that her grief had been transformed. Where once she mourned a man she believed she knew, she now mourned the possibility that she had never fully known him at all. The congregation continued to watch her, their eyes pressing down with the weight of expectation. Some waited for a scene, others for denial, others for a collapse. But Margaret gave them nothing. She let her silence stretch, let it cover the whispers and the stares, because to speak now would be to choose a side before she understood the truth herself. So she sat unmoving, her gaze locked on a coffin, as though the man inside might still answer her if she stared long enough. The lilies of the altar filled the air with their cloying perfume, mingling with the damp chill from outside. The organ remained silent, the minister frozen in indecision, Thomas's siblings restless with their anger, and still Margaret stayed in her silence, refusing to lash out, refusing to grant them her grief in any form they could twist. She sought instead within her own memory, combing the years of her marriage for hidden signs, for pieces of a puzzle she had not known she was assembling. But the coffin, smooth and impenetrable, offered nothing back. It stood as both answer and riddle, holding the secrets of a man she had buried, leaving her to wonder she had also buried the truth of her life alongside him. The chapel air had grown heavy, thick with words that lingered long after they were spoken. Anna's declaration still hovered like smoke that refused to clear, and the family's outrage had only fanned it into something darker, more dangerous. The congregation shifted uneasily in their seats, torn between grief for the man they had come to bury and fascination with the scandal unfolding before them. Margaret sat motionless, her silence a stark contrast to the storm of whispers surrounding her. Yet even silence could not hold back the intrusion of practicality, of the business that death inevitably carried with it. From the side aisle, a man cleared his throat. It was subtle at first, but in the brittle quiet that followed the outburst of Thomas's siblings, the sound drew attention like a sudden knock at a door. All eyes turned to the figure rising near the back, tall, spare, dressed in a dark suit that seemed too formal even for the occasion. He carried a slim leather folder under one arm, and though his expression was carefully composed, the faint unease in his eyes betrayed the difficulty of his task. This was Mr. Carroway, the family lawyer, a man who had known Thomas for decades, whose voice had settled disputes and signed agreements that shaped the Hale household. He inclined his head slightly, as if asking permission to speak, though no one had invited him. "If I may," he began, his voice steady but low, "I must remind the family that Mr. Hale's estate is scheduled to be settled in the coming days." The reading of his was been arranged. His gaze flicked briefly toward Margaret, then to Anna, before returning to the center of the room. It is in that forum that questions of provision, of inheritance, and of responsibility will be addressed. The words settled over the congregation with a different weight, colder than grief, sharper than accusation. The mention of the will drew every speculation into focus. What Anna had claimed was not just an affair, not just betrayal, but the possibility of a child with rightful claim. It was one thing to dismiss her as an opportunist, but the law gave her a place among them. If Thomas had provided for her in writing, then denial would no longer be possible. Eleanor muttered furiously to Richard, their anger sharpening into fear. Several guests exchanged glances, their whispers now tinged with curiosity about the size of the estate, about who stood to gain or lose. Even those who had come out of duty or respect could not help but feel the pull of the practical, the undeniable truth that death brought not only sorrow but division over what remained. Margaret felt the words like another blow, though softer than Anna's revelation, quieter, more insidious. She had lived beside Thomas for 30 years, believing that whatever else might be uncertain, their life together had been theirs to share. Now, she was forced to wonder if his last words on paper, his instructions after death, would reveal a life she had never seen. Had he made provisions for another woman, another child? Had he carved their future into legal ink without her knowledge? Anna's posture shifted slightly, her hand still on her stomach, her eyes lowering as though she understood the implication. Whatever sympathy her presence might have stirred was now complicated by suspicion. Was her claim born of grief or strategy? Did she come here to honor a promise, or stake a claim before the ink on the will could dictate her child's fate? The minister shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing the moment had not been hijacked by matters of law, yet unable to contradict the intrusion. The funeral no longer felt like a space for farewells. It had become the opening act of something larger, a contest between memory, morality, and legality. Margaret's gaze did not leave the coffin, though her thoughts spiraled. The man inside had spoken often of duty, of honor, of providing for his family. But what did family mean to him in the end? Did it mean her, the children they had raised together, the life they had built? Or had it also meant the woman now standing at his side in death, carrying the child who might carry his name forward? The lawyer adjusted the folder in his hands, his eyes flicking again toward Margaret, as though to assure her that answers would come soon, whether she wanted them or not. Then he stepped back into the shadows, his reminder delivered, leaving the chapel heavier than before. The service had not yet ended, yet already the grief was being measured against the weight of property, inheritance, and legacy. Motives clung to every face: anger, fear, suspicion, even hope. And Margaret, still silent, knew that the next gathering of these same people would not be for prayer or farewell, but for the cold, binding words of will that might rewrite her life all over again. The rest of the service stumbled forward, though it never recovered its rhythm. The minister's voice rose and fell with rehearsed scripture, but few truly listened. The congregation remained restless, their attention fixed more on Anna's quiet defiance and Margaret's unwavering silence than on the words of prayer. The coffin stood between them all, no longer just a vessel of farewell, but a barrier filled with unspoken questions. When the benediction finally concluded and the organ murmured its last notes, the mourners rose in a rustle of fabric and sighs. The air in the chapel was thick with unease, like smoke that refused to disperse. Margaret stood slowly, her children braced in her arms, though she did not lean on them. She moved with deliberate calm, her veil shadowing her face from the curious stares that followed her every step. Anna remained near the coffin, still and awkward under the pressure of so many eyes. For a moment it seemed she might slip out quietly, vanishing into the rain, before anyone could stop her. But Margaret did not allow that possibility. She approached with measured steps, each one echoing faintly against the wooden floor. The crowd parted in silence, eager to see what would unfold, but unwilling to miss a word. When Margaret reached her, she paused, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her voice low and even. "Not here," she said, the words clipped but firm. "After this, you and I will speak. Alone." Anna's eyes flickered with hesitation, but she nodded. Her hand drifted instinctively to her stomach, as though the unborn child within might steady her. She did not reply, but Margaret needed no answer. The understanding between them was sealed, fragile but unmistakable. The procession to the cemetery passed in a blur. Rain fell lightly, dampening hats and veils. The ground slicked beneath shoes. Margaret walked in silence, her children close, their faces tight with unasked questions. Behind them, whispers followed like a second funeral march. Anna walked alone, a few paces back, her presence like a shadow Margaret could not shake. When the casket was lowered, when the prayers ended, when earth struck with muted thuds, Margaret kept her eyes fixed forward. Grief pressed heavy on her chest, but beneath it burned a sharper need, the need to confront the girl who had unraveled her world with a single word. Later, as mourners drifted toward waiting cars, Margaret stepped aside beneath the dripping branches of an oak tree. She waited until the crowd thinned, until only Anna lingered near the path, uncertain and pale. With a small tilt of her head, Margaret beckoned her. Anna hesitated, then approached, her steps cautious. The rain had soaked through both their clothes, leaving the fabric clinging, hair damp against their faces. They stood apart from the others, the gray stones of the cemetery, their only witnesses. For a long moment, Neither spoke. Margaret studied her, searching the girl's face for traces of Thomas. Some shape of the eyes, some tilt of the mouth, that might make the claim undeniable. Anna met her gaze without flinching, though her lower lip trembled slightly. Margaret's voice was quiet, but steady when she finally spoke. "You want to be heard. Now you'll tell me everything." "Not for them." She glanced back toward the chapel where whispers still lingered. "But for me." Anna's shoulders sagged, as though the weight of secrecy had become too much to bear. She nodded slowly, her hand tightening once more over her stomach. "I will," she whispered. In that moment, the storm of voices from the chapel seemed far away. The gossiping eyes, the accusations, the judgment, they no longer mattered. What lay ahead was a different trial, one fought not in public, but between widow and mistress, between the life Margaret had lived and the truth that might shatter it. The rain continued to fall, soft and steady, as the two women stood facing each other in the cemetery's quiet. One carried the weight of 30 years of marriage. The other carried the promise of a future unborn. Between them lay Thomas Hale, silent now, yet binding them together in ways neither could escape. The cemetery was nearly empty by the time Margaret and Anna stood together in the quiet. The damp earth still unsettled over Thomas's grave. The rain had slowed to a mist, soft against their faces, but the air remained thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Margaret held herself upright, her veil clinging to her cheeks, her eyes sharp though her voice was steady. She had demanded the girls speak, and now the silence stretched between them, waiting to be broken. Anna shifted on her feet, her hands instinctively resting on the curve of her stomach, as if to steady herself. She looked younger now, stripped of the defiance that had carried her through the chapel. Her eyes lowered before she lifted them again, meeting Margaret's gaze with a mixture of fear and determination. When she began, her voice was soft, but the words carried with them the force of something long kept secret. "He used to come at night," Anna said. "Never when the sun was up, never where anyone could see. He told me it had to be that way, that he couldn't risk being seen in town with me. At first, I thought it was shame. But he said it was protection. For me, for the baby he knew we would one day have." Her voice faltered slightly, then grew steadier. "He promised me it wouldn't always be like that. That one day, after you, there would be a life for us." Margaret did not flinch, though her chest tightened at the words. The calm mask she wore remained in place, but inside her thoughts reeled. "After you," the phrase struck deeper than any accusation, suggesting that Thomas had built a future beyond her, waiting only for her absence. Anna continued, her tone quiet but insistent. "He rented a place, a small apartment in the city near the river. Nothing grand, nothing that would draw attention. But it was ours, or that's what he said. He kept clothes there, some books, even a chair he said reminded him of home. He'd sit in it and tell me stories, not the kind you tell your wife or children, but stories, he said, he couldn't share with anyone else. He called it our refuge." Margaret felt the damp air pressing closer, every detail pulling at threads she had tried to hold together. She thought of the nights Thomas had claimed to be away for business, of the unexplained receipts she had once dismissed as clerical errors, of the hours unaccounted for that she had chosen not to question. Each memory returned now like a stone falling into place, forming a path she had never allowed herself to see. "He told me," Anna whispered, her eyes glassy now, "that he loved me, that he wanted a family with me. He said he couldn't leave you, not then, not while the children still needed him. But he swore that in time, things would change. He said he would find a way. And when I told him about the baby, he cried. He said it was what he'd been waiting for." The rain clung to Margaret's veil, her gloves damp at her sides. She stared at Anna, her face unreadable, though every word struck deeper than the last. She wanted to dismiss them as lies, to call the girl a manipulator who had chosen the moment of his funeral to wound her. Yet the precision of Anna's account, the small details that matched too neatly with the fragments Margaret herself had ignored, made denial harder with every breath. Anna lowered her gaze again, her hands circling her stomach slowly. "I didn't come here to take anything from you. I just couldn't let him be buried without someone knowing who he was to me, to us. He promised me we wouldn't be hidden forever. I don't know what he wrote in his will, I don't know if he left anything for this child, but I know what he said when he looked at me, and I know the life growing inside me is his." The cemetery was silent around them, the mist falling softly on the rows of stones. Margaret's heart beat painfully in her chest as she stood listening, her body rigid though her thoughts were unraveling. She had spent the service holding her silence, clinging to composure in the face of scandal. Now, in the quiet with only this girl before her, she felt the sharp edge of betrayal more keenly than she ever had. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she turned her eyes toward the fresh mound of earth that marked Thomas's grave. The man she had buried had carried secrets. And here, in the words of another woman, they were unfolding piece by piece. She searched the damp soil as though it might yield an answer, but remained silent, just as he always had when she asked too many questions. And in that silence, Margaret knew that her grief had become something more complicated than mourning. It had become a reckoning. The mist hung low in the cemetery, softening the edges of the gravestones, muffling the sounds of footsteps retreating to waiting cars. Only a few stragglers remained, their glances lingering too long, before finally leaving Margaret and Anna alone beneath the dripping oak. Margaret stood rooted to the spot, her body taut with the effort of composure. Anna, pale and damp, seemed to hesitate, as though deciding how far to go. Then, with a trembling hand, she reached into the worn satchel slung over her shoulder. "I didn't want to bring this here," Anna murmured, her voice unsteady. "But I knew no one would believe me otherwise." Her fingers worked clumsily with the clasp, and from the bag she withdrew a bundle wrapped carefully in a cloth. Margaret's eyes narrowed, her breath tightening as she watched. Anna unfolded the fabric to reveal a small stack of letters tied with a thin ribbon, and beneath them, several photographs whose edges were curled with handling. She held them out, hesitant but determined. "He wrote these to me. I kept everyone. And these," she gestured to the photographs, "he said were just for us." Margaret stared at the items as though they were foreign objects, dangerous to touch. For a moment, she could not bring herself to extend her hand. But Anna stepped closer, the rain dampening the ribbon until it darkened in color, the paper spotted with moisture. Finally, Margaret lifted her gloved hand and took them. The weight was slight, but it pressed against her like iron. The first letter slipped free of the stack, and though her instinct screamed to stop, her eyes fell on familiar handwriting. Thomas's slanted script, unmistakable, sprawled across the page in ink she knew too well. Her heart thudded as she read the opening line. "My dearest Anna, I hate these nights apart." The words blurred for a moment, the veil of her grief colliding with the betrayal that now burned sharper. She forced herself to keep reading, each sentence carving deeper. Promises of a future, tender declarations, apologies for secrecy, reassurances that she was not alone. Her fingers trembled as she reached the second letter, then the third. The handwriting was undeniably his, the turns of phrase familiar in their intimacy. She remembered the way he had once written to her in their youth, when they were first engaged, how his words had carried that same fervor. To see it now, replicated for another, was a wound she had not imagined possible. She turned to the photographs with dread. The first showed Thomas seated at a small table, his hand resting on Anna's. His face was softened with a smile Margaret recognized, one he had rarely worn in recent years. The next photograph captured him standing beside Anna on a balcony, his arm protective around her shoulders, the river glinting faintly in the background. In another, he was looking not at the camera but at Anna, his expression tender, almost boyish. Margaret's breath caught. The intimacy was undeniable, the evidence irrefutable. She felt her knees weaken, and for a moment she feared she might collapse onto the damp earth. But she held herself rigid, gripping the papers and photographs as though they might vanish if she loosened her hold. Her resolve, so carefully guarded throughout the day, shook under the weight of proof she could no longer deny. Anna's voice broke the silence. "I never meant to hurt you. I only wanted to show you that I wasn't lying. He loved me. He loved this child." Her hand circled protectively over her stomach, her eyes pleading, not for forgiveness but for acknowledgement. Margaret did not answer immediately. Her gaze drifted to Thomas's grave, the mound of earth freshly turned, rain seeping into the soil. She thought of the vows they had exchanged, the years spent in shared routine, the children they had raised together. She thought of the nights she had sat alone, waiting for him, trusting him. And now here were the letters, the photographs, tearing open the quiet narrative of their marriage to reveal a parallel life she had never been allowed to see. Her silence was no longer armor, but fracture. She could feel the eyes of the past pressing in, demanding she admit what the evidence laid bare. The man she had buried was not the man she had believed him to be. And as she stood with the proof clutched in her trembling hands, Margaret realized her grief had split into something unrecognizable, half mourning, half fury, and wholly uncertain of where it might lead. Margaret lingered in the cemetery long after Anna had gone, the bundle of letters and photographs tucked tightly beneath her arm. The weight of them seemed heavier than the coffin they had lowered into the earth earlier that day. When she finally returned home, the house felt hollow, each familiar room echoing with the absence of Thomas. She set the bundle on his desk in the study, but she could not bring herself to open it again. The sight of his handwriting was enough to split her chest in two. She sat in his chair, her fingers tracing the grooves he had worn into the wooden arms over the years, and her mind began to wander through the corridors of memory. At first, the images came in sharp fragments. Thomas standing in the doorway with his suitcase, his tie loosened, say he had to catch a late train for a client meeting. Thomas returning days later, tired but oddly buoyant, carrying a gift wrapped in crisp paper, insisting it was just a little something he saw and thought of her. She remembered how she had smiled, how she had thanked him, never questioning where the money came from or why the gestures always followed his unexplained absences. Now, each of those moments shifted under scrutiny. She replayed the business trips that had never quite aligned with the calendar she kept in her head. There had been times when she called the hotel number he'd given her only to be told no one by that name was registered. He had brushed it off later, laughing, blaming clerical errors, insisting she must have dialed incorrectly. She had let herself believe him, because doubt then would have been like poison seeping into the walls of her marriage. There were nights where he returned home later than expected, smelling faintly of cologne she didn't recognize. She had teased him once, suggesting he must have been out impressing someone, but he had kissed her cheek and told her he only ever wanted to impress her. His charm had disarmed her, his words so smooth they left no room for suspicion. Yet beneath the comfort of those reassurances, she now recognized a faint echo of guilt, cleverly disguised as devotion. She thought, too, of his sudden generosity. The weekend he brought her pearls without occasion, the time he filled the kitchen with flowers simply because it was Tuesday. She had cherished those surprises, believed they were tokens of love that still ran deep despite the years and the wear of routine. Now she wondered if each gift had been a salve for his conscience, a distraction meant to keep her from asking questions about where he had been or who had been with him. Her mind returned again and again to the small absences that had once seemed inconsequential. A missed dinner, an unreturned call, a change in schedule he never explained beyond a hurried excuse. They piled together now, forming a timeline she could not ignore, a map of a life that had run parallel to hers all along. Margaret pressed her hands against her temples, as though she could force the memories into silence. But they refused to relent. They came unbidden, each detail twisted now into evidence. She thought of the letters and photographs Anne had shown her, their authenticity undeniable, and she felt her certainty in her marriage crumble piece by piece. The house seemed to conspire with her thoughts. The smell of his book still lingered in the study. The creak of the floorboards echoed his familiar stride. The faint indent on the side of bed upstairs remained untouched. Every trace of him whispered loyalty, yet the evidence in her possession shouted betrayal. She felt caught between two realities, the man she had loved and the man revealed in Anna's story. Her eyes fell on the photograph on the mantel, taken years ago on their 20th anniversary. Thomas had his arm around her, his smile wide and easy, the picture of a devoted husband. She had always believed the photograph captured truth. But now, looking at it in the dim light, she wondered if the image was nothing more than performance, one of many masks he had worn to keep her blind. The doubt gnawed at her relentlessly. Had her entire marriage been built on half-truths and careful omissions? Or had Thomas truly loved her once, only to drift into another life as the years wore on? She did not know which possibility hurt more, The idea that she had been deceived from the beginning, or that she had been loved and then abandoned quietly, piece by piece, without ever noticing it happen. Margaret leaned back in his chair, her eyes burning, her body heavy with exhaustion. For the first time since his death, she no longer mourned only the man she had lost. She mourned the certainty she would never regain, the trust that had been shattered, and the memories that could never again be recalled without doubt. The house had grown unbearably quiet after the funeral, the kind of silence that settled heavy in corners and seemed to cling to the walls. Margaret remained in the study long after the mourners had gone, sitting in Thomas's chair with a bundle of letters untouched before her. The rain outside had turned steady again, pattering against the windows, and the sound only made the silence inside sharper. She had not realized how much time had passed until she heard the creak of the floorboards behind her. David was the first to appear, his tall frame filling the doorway. He had inherited his father's broad shoulders, but in that moment he looked unsteady, shifting from one foot to the other as though he did not know whether to enter or remain at the threshold. Clara followed close behind, her arms folded tightly, her face pale but determined. They had kept their composure through the service, sitting like sentinels on either side of their mother, but now that they were home the dam of restraint had begun to crack. "Mother," David began, his voice low, though it carried an edge that betrayed the storm brewing beneath. "You have to tell us. That woman, what she said, was it true?" Margaret did not look up at once. She kept her eyes on the bundle, her fingers tracing the ribbon that bound it. Her silence stretched, and she could feel her children's eyes pressing into her, demanding answers she did not yet have the strength to give. Clara stepped forward, her voice sharper than her brother's. She called him father, right there in front of everyone, and she had no shame about it. "If it's a lie, then say it's a lie. But if it isn't," her words faltered, her chin trembling before she forced it steady again. "If it isn't, then we deserve to know." Margaret finally lifted her head. Her children's faces were mirrors of grief, layered now with confusion and anger. She wished she could comfort them with certainty, tell them that Anna's claim was nothing more than fabrication. But the letters, the photographs, those small, damning pieces of evidence, still lay before her. She had not yet shown them, not yet admitted how deep the betrayal reached. "I don't know," Margaret said softly, the words slipping out almost against her will. "I want to believe it isn't true. But there are things I cannot explain." David's jaw clenched. "You mean the trips? The nights he wasn't home?" His voice rose, anger mingling with grief. "We noticed, too. We just thought he was working. That's what he always said. Were we all just blind?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, though she refused to let them fall. "He promised us he'd always be honest. He promised you." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as if to keep it from trembling. Margaret looked at them, her heart breaking at the pain etched across their faces. She wanted to shield them, to protect their memory of the man who had raised them. But she could not undo what had been spoken, nor could she erase the evidence she had seen with her own eyes. "Your father was many things," she said quietly. "He was proud of you both. He loved you. Of that I am certain. But there are pieces of him I may never have known." Her words hung heavy in the air. David turned away, running a hand through his hair in frustration, while Clara finally let a tear fall, quickly wiping it with the back of her hand. Neither found comfort in their mother's honesty. Instead, it left them adrift, caught between loyalty to their father's memory and suspicion of the man he might have been. Margaret felt the divide widening between them, not only between parent and child, but between the life they thought they had lived and the one that was now unraveling before them. She reached out, her hand trembling, but neither child moved closer. Their grief had taken on a new shape, twisted now by betrayal, and she could do nothing but watch as it settled over them like a shadow they could not escape. The following morning arrived with little light, the sky outside the windows a dull gray that seemed unwilling to brighten. Margaret had not slept. She had spent most of the night sitting upright in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the restless movements of her children in their own rooms. Their grief, once simple in its sharpness, had turned jagged, edged with doubt. Margaret carried the weight of it on her shoulders, yet she also carried her own questions that refused to be quiet. By mid-morning, She found herself in Thomas's study. The room smelled faintly of his cologne, a scent that lingered in the fabric of the curtains and the leather of the chair behind the desk. The space had always been his domain, the door often closed, the drawers locked. She had respected that boundary for years, convinced it was his place of order, his retreat. Now, standing in the middle of it, she wondered if it had been a chamber for secrets instead. The desk drawers opened reluctantly, the brass handles stiff from years of disuse by anyone but him. Inside, neat stacks of papers rested in precise order, just as Thomas had always kept them. Margaret sifted through envelopes, bank statements, and documents that at first seemed routine. But the further she dug, the more her heart began to quicken. Beneath a folder of tax records, she found an envelope stamped with the name of a leasing office in the city. She unfolded the papers inside, her hands trembling as her eyes scanned the words. It was a rental agreement, signed in Thomas's handwriting, for a modest apartment by the river. The lease dated back nearly 3 years and had been renewed twice. Margaret pressed the page flat on the desk, her breath catching as she imagined the space Anna had described, the place Thomas had called their refuge. She set the lease aside with care, though her fingers wanted to tear it into shreds. Another envelope surfaced from beneath a pile of receipts. This one contained a list of transactions from a jewelry shop she did not recognize. Her eyes moved down the items. A necklace, a bracelet, earrings, each purchase dated on nights when Thomas had claimed to be away on business. Margaret's stomach twisted as she realized she had never seen these gifts. They had not been meant for her. Her gloved hands dropped the receipts onto the desk, the papers fanning out like accusations. She sat heavily in his chair, the leather groaning under her weight, and let the evidence surround her. Each document was a shard of glass cutting into the image she had held of her husband. He had built another life, piece by piece, financed it, maintained it, while she remained at home, faithful to a version of him that no longer existed. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against her clasped hands, the smell of the paper sharp in her nose. Every memory she had replayed in her mind the night before, the business trips, the unexplained absences, the sudden generosity, now found proof in these papers. They were not harmless oversights. They were signposts leading to another woman, another world. Margaret forced herself to gather the documents into a neat stack. She tucked them back into the envelope, though she could not bring herself to place them where she had found them. Instead, she set them on top of the desk, in plain view, as though leaving them exposed might lessen the burden of secrecy. The room seemed to shrink around her, the shelves of books watching silently, the photographs of Thomas smiling down from the walls betraying her with their false sense of loyalty. For years she had told herself that marriage was built on trust, that what she did not question was proof of her faith. Now she saw that her silence had been a shield, one Thomas had used to keep his other life hidden. As she sat in his chair, surrounded by the evidence of his deception, Margaret felt the last remnants of certainty slip away. The man she had loved was gone, and in his place was a stranger she had buried, leaving her to sort through the ruins he had left behind. Margaret sat at the long dining table, the late afternoon light slanting weakly through the curtains. The house was too quiet. Even the ticking of the old clock seemed heavy, each second dragging slower than the last. On the polish before her lay the stack of papers she had uncovered in Thomas's study. The lease, the receipts, the damning evidence she had not yet shown her children. She had barely touched her tea, the cup sitting cold at her elbow, when the knock came at the door. It was Mr. Carroway, the family's lawyer, punctual as always, his hat in his hand and his expression carefully schooled into solemnity. He had been present at the funeral, offering condolences in his reserved way. But now his visit carried a different weight. Margaret invited him in, her voice low, and he followed her to the dining room, where he set his briefcase down with the care of a man preparing to deliver unwelcome truths. He took a seat opposite her, folded his hands over the case, and studied her face for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Hale," he began gently, "I wish our meeting today were under simpler circumstances. Unfortunately, there are matters that must be addressed sooner rather than later." Margaret inclined her head slightly, her composure fragile but intact. "It's about her," she said, sparing him the effort of pretense. Her voice did not waver, though inside she felt her stomach knot. Mr. Carroway sighed, confirming what she already knew. Yes, about Miss Anna and the claim she has made. I realize how painful this is, but I must speak plainly. If her child is indeed Thomas's, the law would recognize that child as an heir. The words settled over the room like lead. Margaret felt her throat tighten, though she forced herself to keep her gaze steady on him. Even though the child is not mine, even though he was married to me. Yes, the lawyer said, his tone careful but firm. The law does not distinguish between children born within a marriage and those born outside of it, at least not when it comes to inheritance. If paternity is established, the child is entitled to a portion of the estate, equal to that of your own children. Margaret's hands, resting on the table, curled slightly against the surface. And how would that be established? Thomas is gone. There can be no test. Carroway adjusted his glasses. Not directly, no, but there are other means. Personal effects can be used, letters, hair, even items from which DNA might be extracted. In cases of dispute, the court could order such testing. And given the presence of photographs and correspondence, which I understand Miss Anna possesses, her claim cannot be dismissed outright. Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her. The letters she had already read, the photographs she had already seen, they were more than betrayals. They were evidence that could shift the balance of everything Thomas had left behind. The lawyer lowered his voice. I must caution you, Mrs. Hale, if she pursues this matter formally, and the child is born with proof of paternity, the estate will be divided accordingly. That includes property, financial assets, and any trust established for your children. It would not erase your share, but it would reduce it. The law is clear on this. Margaret stared at the teacup cooling beside her, her reflection faint in its surface. Her life, her children's future, the home she had built over decades, it all seemed to tremble on the edge of uncertainty. Is there any way, she asked slowly, to prevent her from making such a claim? Carroway hesitated, not without considerable risk. To challenge her would mean dragging this into court, making the matter public. I cannot advise it unless there is no other option. Scandal will follow either way, I'm afraid. He closed his briefcase with a quiet snap, his voice softening. My duty is to prepare you, Mrs. Hale, not to alarm you. But I must impress upon you, this child's existence, if proven, cannot be ignored. Margaret did not respond. She sat in silence, her mind replaying every moment of her marriage, every promise Thomas had made. Every night he had left her with excuses she had believed. Now those excuses had birthed a living consequence, one that threatened not only her memory of him, but the very foundation of her family's future. The lawyer rose quietly, offering a small bow of his head. I will return in 2 days for the formal reading of the will. Until then, I suggest you prepare yourself and your children for what may come. When the door closed behind him, the house seemed emptier than before. Margaret remained at the table, staring at the papers before her, knowing that the secrets she had discovered in Thomas's study were no longer her burden alone. They were evidence in a battle that had only just begun. The house grew colder once the lawyer's footsteps faded down the front walk, the click of the door echoing like a seal upon everything he had said. Margaret remained at the dining table, her hands clenched in her lap, her jaw locked so tightly she thought her teeth might crack. The papers still sat before her, the receipts and the lease, evidence she had unearthed with her own trembling fingers. They had shifted from documents to accusations, each line of ink mocking her with the life her husband had built beyond her reach. For hours she sat motionless, the quiet pressing in, until something inside her gave way. The composure she had worn like armor since the funeral shattered. She rose abruptly, the chair scraping hard against the floorboards, and swept the papers from the table with a single strike of her arm. They scattered like startled birds, fluttering to the floor in a storm of proof she no longer wished to see. Her breath came sharp, uneven, each inhale catching against a fire that burned in her chest. She moved through the house, her hands restless, touching every place he had once occupied. His books on the shelves, lined neatly as if his hand had arranged them only yesterday. His coat still hanging by the door, the faintest trace of his scent clinging to its wool. She gripped the sleeve until her knuckles blanched, then flung it down, as though the fabric itself were complicit in his betrayal. In the parlor, the clock he had wound every Sunday ticked on without him, steady and merciless. She pressed her palm against the glass face, willing it to stop, to falter, to acknowledge the way time had ended for her the moment she learned who he truly was. Her grief, once soft and suffocating, hardened into rage. It was not the hot fury of sudden quarrel, but the deeper kind, slow and corrosive, born of years of trust repaid with deception. She replayed the funeral in her mind, the sight of Anna's hand upon the coffin, the audacity of that single word spoken aloud for all to hear. She had wanted to scream then, to cast the girl out into the rain, but she had remained silent, frozen in place. Now alone, the scream tore its way from her throat, ragged and raw, filling the empty rooms with sound that startled even herself. Her gaze fell on the framed photograph above the mantel, their wedding day captured in fading tones. Thomas, young and handsome, his arm around her shoulders, his smile so sure, hers so trusting. She snatched it from the wall, her fingers trembling, and for a long moment she considered shattering the glass against the hearth. But she couldn't. She pressed it against her chest instead, her anger twisting with grief until the two were indistinguishable. She hated him for the lies, but she still loved the man she thought he was, and that contradiction tore at her like claws. The coffin rose in her mind, not as a place of rest, but as a vessel of silence. It held his body, yes, but also his answers, buried with him where she could never reach. Every question she now burned to ask, the nights away, the gifts, the promises, was locked inside, sealed beneath earth and wood. The coffin had become his final betrayal, a refusal to speak even when the truth was demanded. She had buried not only her husband, but also the only one who could explain the life he had hidden from her. Margaret sank to her knees on the rug, her fists pressed into the fibers, her breath harsh and uneven. She wanted to hate Anna, to blame her for the ruin of everything. But she could not. The blame circled back always to him, to Thomas, the man she had trusted beyond question. He had left her with a hollow house, with children who now looked at her for answers she could not give, with a future threatened by a stranger's unborn child. The rage burned hot, then cold, then hot again, a cycle she could not control. It left her trembling, exhausted, staring at the scattered papers across the floor. She wanted to destroy them, to erase every trace of his betrayal, but some part of her could not. They were her only connection to the truth, however bitter it tasted. And so she sat among them, her grief twisted beyond recognition, her love for him fractured into fury. The coffin in the earth became not a place of peace, but a reminder of his silence, and that silence would haunt her more deeply than the loss of his voice ever could. The days following the funeral were marked not by peace, but by the hum of gossip. The town, small enough for every secret to feel like common property, found in Anna's presence a story too compelling to resist. Shop doors opened wider when she passed. Conversations cut short until she had moved on, and then resumed in sharper whispers the moment her back was turned. She became the subject of glances exchanged across market stalls, of murmurs that followed her from the bakery to the apothecary. She timed it for the funeral. One woman said as she handed over coins of bread, knew the widow would be too broken to fight her. "She's after money," another insisted, her voice low but her eyes gleaming. "Mark my words, she'll be at the lawyer's office before the month is out." Everywhere Anna went, speculation traveled beside her like a shadow. Some called her shameless. Others pitied her, though pity often carried the same sting as scorn. The rounded curve of her stomach made her claim impossible to ignore, yet that same visible proof drew sharper judgment. For those who had admired Thomas in life, it was easier to cast Anna as a schemer than to accept that he might have strayed. Margaret heard the whispers too, though they reached her in more careful tones. Friends who stopped by the house to deliver condolences often lingered too long in the parlor, their questions disguised as concern. "Have you spoken to her again?" they asked delicately. She seemed so bold that day. Surely it was a stunt. The words were meant to soothe, to assure Margaret that her husband's honor remained intact, but she could hear the hunger beneath them. They wanted confirmation, fuel for the stories already spreading. She offered none. Instead, She nodded politely, her face composed, her voice neutral. The truth was not theirs to know, though it pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe. She had seen the letters, the photographs. She had held the receipts in her hands. She could not dismiss Anna as a liar, yet the fury in her heart made it impossible to embrace her as a victim. One afternoon, Margaret saw Anna herself in town. She was leaving the grocer's, her arms full of parcels, her steps slow and cautious. People moved aside as she passed, but not kindly, more as though she carried contagion. A cluster of women outside the milliner's shop tilted their heads together, their eyes tracking her every move. "She'll bring nothing but shame to that family," one hissed, loud enough for Anna to hear. Margaret watched from across the street, her own stomach tightening as Anna's face flushed, though she kept her head high and her pace steady. In that moment, Margaret's fury faltered, replaced by something she did not want to name. Pity crept in unwanted, like water through a cracked roof. Anna was young, too young to have been burdened with such choices. She carried not only a child, but also the weight of a town's judgment, the sting of every whisper that cut her dignity apart. And yet, Margaret's compassion was not unbroken. It clashed against the memory of Thomas's betrayal, against the life he had promised to Anna while erasing the truth from his wife. At night, Margaret sat in the quiet of her home and thought of Anna alone in her small rented room, clutching the letters as though they were lifelines. She imagined the girl waking in the dark, afraid of what awaited her, yet clinging to Thomas's promises as though they had not already been buried with him. Margaret could not decide whether to despise her or to feel sorry for her. Both emotions warred within her, neither winning, each one leaving her exhausted. The neighbors continued their murmurs, confident in their judgment, eager to choose sides. For them, Anna was easy to condemn. For Margaret, she was impossible to categorize. She was at once a thief of trust and a vessel of truth, a reminder of betrayal and a figure of loneliness. And so Margaret watched her from a distance, torn between a fury that demanded vengeance and the pity that whispered of shared grief. The room Anna returned to each night was small, no larger than a modest kitchen, its plaster walls thin enough that she could hear the pipes groan whenever someone in the building turned on a tap. The floorboards creaked under her steps, and a single window looked out onto a narrow alley where laundry lines sagged between brick walls. She had furnished it as best she could with second-hand pieces, a narrow bed pressed against one wall, a chip dresser with one drawer that stuck, and a small table near the window where she set down her meager meals. Yet for all its simplicity, the space felt crowded, filled with the weight of expectation, the silent reminder of the child she carried. She lowered herself onto the bed carefully, her hand resting instinctively on the swell of her stomach. The day had left her exhausted. The funeral, the confrontation, the sharp judgment in the eyes of strangers, it had all settled into her bones, leaving her body heavy, her breath shallow. From her bag, she drew a thin envelope and opened it with practiced care. Inside were several ultrasound photos, their black and white images faint but unmistakable. She spread them out on the bed before her, smoothing the edges with her fingertips as though they might crumble without her touch. Her eyes lingered on the shapes that represented the future, the small curve of a head, the faint outline of tiny limbs. Each time she looked at them, her throat tightened with both fear and determination. These images were proof, silent and undeniable, that she was not alone, even if the world insisted she was. She pressed one photo against her chest, closing her eyes, whispering words meant only for the child. "He wanted you," she said softly, though her voice wavered. "He promised he would be here. I know you don't understand, but I swear he wanted you." The words rang hollow in the quiet room, bouncing back against her with the weight of doubt. She had clung to Thomas's assurances, his whispered vows that once things were different, once time had passed, they would build a life together. Yet those promises now lay buried with him, leaving her to face the consequences alone. She had nothing but the letters, the photographs, and the swelling proof within her body. They were not comfort enough to still the nights when fear pressed close and sleep refused to come. On the dresser, she kept a small glass jar where she dropped coins whenever she'd spare them. It rattled with pitiful lightness whenever she shook it. Rent was due soon, and she knew the envelope in her purse held barely enough. She had stretched every dollar Thomas had given her, but with him gone there was no more to come. She thought of the lawyer's words, of the inheritance that might one day be hers if the child was recognized, but those were distant possibilities, tangled in courts and conflict. Hunger and bills were not distant. They were here, demanding payment every week. She curled onto her side, clutching the ultrasound photos, as though they were talismans against despair. The room smelled faintly of damp wood, the ceiling stained with old leaks, but she ignored it. She focused instead on the rhythmic pulse she sometimes felt from within, the reminder that life was moving forward, that she could not allow herself to stop. Tears came then, quiet at first, then harder, shaking her shoulders as she buried her face in the thin pillow. She cried for Thomas, for promises undone, for the cold stares of neighbors who saw only a schemer. But most of all, she cried for the uncertainty of tomorrow. Would the child she carried grow up hated? Would he be denied the name of the man who had fathered him? When the tears subsided, Anna wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, her resolve stiffening. She gathered the photos once more, tucking them carefully back into their envelope. She placed them on the table beside the bed, within reach but safe from the damp floor. Then she lay back, her hand once again pressed protectively over her stomach. The night stretched long and silent, broken only by the distant sound of a neighbor's radio and the soft hum of the building settling. Anna kept her eyes open until exhaustion finally pulled them closed. She slept clutching the memory of Thomas's words, her body curled protectively around the life growing within her, as though she alone could shield them both from the weight of the world waiting beyond her thin walls. The tension in the Hale household reached a breaking point the evening Margaret gathered her children in the parlor. The lamps cast a dull glow across the room, their light pooling on the polished surfaces, making the silence between them even heavier. David stood by the window, his arms folded tightly across his chest, his jaw clenched. Clara sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her hands twisting in her lap. Both had avoided speaking of Anna for days, but now the matter could no longer be ignored. David was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "We need proof," he said, his tone clipped, each word sharp. "If she's lying, then she needs to be exposed. And if she isn't," he trailed off, the unspoken conclusion hanging heavy in the air. Clara's voice wavered but held firm. "Then we need to know." "I can't." She stopped, swallowing hard. "I can't go on not knowing if that child is our father's." Margaret sat across from them, her hands folded neatly, though her knuckles were white. She had braced herself for this, but hearing the demand aloud still cut deeply. "He is gone," she said quietly. "There can be no test on him now." David turned sharply, frustration in his voice. "There are other ways. We've all heard of it. Tests done on what's left behind. Hair, clothing, things he used. The courts accept it." He stepped closer to his mother, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and desperation. "She already has letters. Photographs. If we don't fight, those will be enough to sway anyone. We need something stronger. We need science." Clara's gaze moved to her mother, her expression torn between grief and resolve. "Do you have anything of his? Something no one else touched? A brush, a razor, even an old shirt? They say DNA can be taken from those. If we give her the chance to prove it, then at least the truth will be certain." Margaret felt the room closing in. Her eyes darted to the study, the place where Thomas's belongings still lingered as though he had simply stepped out for a moment and would return. She thought of the brush sitting on his dresser upstairs, the razor he'd used every morning, the hair she had swept absent-mindedly from the sink without realizing the weight it might one day carry. Each object was now a relic, not of love but of evidence. Her heart twisted. The coffin in the cemetery was sealed, the body beyond reach. His silence had already become unbearable, but now it was more than emotional. It was an obstacle to truth. All that remained of him were the possessions he had left behind, mundane things that had once seemed ordinary, but now carried the possibility of unraveling or confirming everything. Margaret rose slowly, her face pale but her back straight. "I will look," she said. Her voice was measured, but it shook faintly at the edges. "There are things that belong to him. They may be enough." David exhaled sharply, almost with relief. though his fists remained tight at his sides. Clara nodded, though tears welled in her eyes. Neither child wanted to see their father reduced to fragments of hair and fabric. Yet both understood that doubt was a wound they could not live with forever. Margaret left them in the parlor and climbed the stairs alone. The house seemed to shift around her as she walked, every creak of the floorboards echoing too loudly, every shadow carrying the weight of memory. She entered the bedroom, where his side of the dresser remained untouched, his belongings neatly arranged as though awaiting his return. Her hand hovered over them. Trembling, she picked up his brush, its bristles still catching strands of his dark hair streaked with gray. She touched the razor beside it, the handle worn smooth from years of use. She opened the drawer where he kept his handkerchiefs, some folded, some bearing faint traces of cologne. Each item seemed to whisper his presence, yet each one also betrayed him, reminders that the man she had buried had not been whole in his loyalty. Margaret gathered them slowly, placing them into a small box. She closed the lid firmly, holding it to her chest. Downstairs, her children waited for her, their eyes demanding truth no matter how it might wound them. She walked back to them, the box heavier than its contents, and set it on the table. "These are what remain," she said softly. "If answers are to be found, they must come from these." The room was silent, the gravity of her words filling the space. The family had spoken, and the demand had been made. The dead would be forced to yield his secrets, not through confession, but through the mute testimony of what he had left behind. Margaret had put off the task for as long as she could. The wardrobe at the end of the bedroom loomed each morning when she dressed, its doors closed tight as though guarding the last pieces of Thomas's presence. For weeks after the funeral, she had ignored it, content to let his shirts hang untouched, his suits pressed in neat lines, his scent lingering faintly among the folds of fabric. But the time had come, she told herself. The church had requested donations for families in need, and her children had urged her to part with at least some of his clothing. The thought of strangers wearing his coats or walking in his shoes unsettled her, yet leaving them to gather dust seemed worse. She opened the doors with deliberate slowness, the hinges creaking in protest. The sight of his belongings lined up so precisely made her chest tighten. She reached for a roll of shirts, folding each one carefully before placing them in a box by the bed. The fabric still held the shape of his shoulders, the faint trace of starch in the collars, and she had to pause more than once to steady her hands. A few of the ties still bore faint stains she remembered teasing him about, small reminders of dinners or hurried mornings when he had spilled coffee. Each item was a memory, and each memory threatened to pull her back into grief she was trying desperately to manage. As she pulled a stack of jackets from the far end of the wardrobe, something slipped from between the folds and fluttered to the floor. It was a plain envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, sealed but never posted. Margaret froze, her eyes fixed on it. The handwriting across the front was Thomas's, unmistakable, the bold slant of his letters familiar from years of notes and signatures. There was no address, only her name written in his hand. Margaret. Her breath caught. She bent to pick it up, her fingers trembling as though the paper itself might burn. For a long moment she simply held it, staring at the way he had written her name. She thought of the unopened letters she had once waited for eagerly when he traveled, the joy of seeing his script on an envelope. But this would have been hidden, tucked away where he must have placed it deliberately. She sat down on the edge of the bed, the envelope resting in her lap. Questions rushed in, threatening to overwhelm her. When had he written it? Why had he not given it to her? Had he meant to confess? To explain? Or was it another attempt to preserve appearances? Her heart pounded as she ran her thumb along the sealed flap. The temptation to tear it open was immediate, yet fear held her back. What if it contained the truth she already dreaded? What if it named Anna, the child, the other life he had built in shadows? Margaret closed her eyes, gripping the envelope tightly. The silence of the room pressing on her, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She thought of the letters Anna had shown her, filled with promises and tenderness. Would this letter mirror those words? Or would it be different? An admission meant for the wife he had deceived? At last, she slid a finger beneath the flap, the seal breaking with a faint crack. She unfolded the page inside, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. The words blurred at first, her tears threatening to spill before she had read a single line. She forced herself to focus, to absorb each stroke of ink. The letter was brief, hesitant in tone. He wrote of regret, of burdens he could no longer keep silent. He admitted that he had failed her trust, that choices he'd made could one day surface, and that he feared the hurt it would cause. He wrote of his love for her, claiming it had never diminished, even as his actions betrayed it. There was no mention of Anna by name, no direct acknowledgement of the child, but the implication lingered between the lines like smoke. "I am sorry for what I have hidden." The letter read, asterisk, "and I pray one day you will understand." Asterisk. Margaret lowered the page slowly, her hands shaking. The words were neither confession nor denial, only a shadow of both, leaving her with more questions than answers. Yet they confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. Thomas had known the weight of his secrets, and he had chosen silence over truth. She folded the letter carefully, placing it back into the envelope, and held it against her chest. The discovery was not the comfort she had hoped for, nor was it the closure she needed. It was another fragment, another piece of a puzzle she could not complete. Sitting there among his clothes, surrounded by the scent of the man she had buried, Margaret felt both closer to him and farther away than ever before. The hidden envelope had spoken, but its words offered no peace, only the reminder that the man she had loved had lived a life she could never fully know. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed with the letter in her hands, the faint sound of rain tapping against the window panes. She had read it once already, then again, each time her breath growing shallower, her pulse louder in her ears. The page trembled in her fingers, though the words upon it were steady, written in the careful hand she had known for decades. This was no draft scribbled in haste, no passing note. Thomas had taken his time with it, every stroke of ink deliberate, every phrase measured as if he had known its weight. The letter began without preamble. There was no greeting, no tenderness at the start, only a stark line that cut through like a blade. Asterisk. "I have made mistakes that cannot be undone, and though I love you, Margaret, I have not been faithful to the vows we shared." Asterisk. She had expected vagueness. A hint perhaps, but not the blunt truth. The words were undeniable. They pulled the floor out from under her, leaving her suspended in a silence that felt heavier than any shout. As her eyes moved further down the page, she saw how he circled his guilt with carefully chosen words. He wrote of loneliness that had crept into the spaces between them, of time spent away from home that became something more than work. He admitted to meeting someone, a young woman who, in his words, reminded me of what it was to feel seen again. Margaret stopped at that line, her stomach twisting, her throat dry. The arrogance of it, the selfishness. Had she not seen him every day? Had she not stood by him in sickness, in strain, in the dull ache of ordinary years? Then came the part that chilled her most. "There is a child," the letter said. Asterisk. "I cannot deny it. I do not write this to wound you, but to leave behind truth should silence one day no longer protect us. I have made arrangements to see that the child is not left wanting. I will provide quietly and without burden to you or the children." Asterisk. Margaret pressed the paper against her knees, her knuckles whitening as she gripped it. The words swam before her eyes. He had fathered a child. He had acknowledged it in his own hand. The whispers of the funeral, the claims Anna had made, the photograph she had shown, none of it could be dismissed as invention now. Here was Thomas, confirming it in writing, his confession sealed away until death forced it into light. He wrote of his intention to shield her from shame, to keep the knowledge hidden so that she would never suffer public humiliation. He wrote of the life he had built with her, insisting that it remained the foundation of his heart, that his failings had not diminished his love for her or for their children. Yet each line felt hollow, contradicted by the very act of betrayal he described. His words sought to soften the blow, but instead they deepened it, reminding her that he had lived a double life, husband and father at home, lover and provider in secret. Margaret set the letter down on her lap, staring at the wardrobe still heavy with his clothes. The air in the room felt stifling, thick with the scent of dust and old fabric. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her face, struggling to breathe. This was the truth she had feared and resisted. It was no longer speculation, no longer gossip carried on the breath of neighbors. It was Thomas himself, speaking from beyond the grave, admitting in ink what he had never dared to say aloud. The coffin in the ground now seemed like a barrier, a vault that held not only his body but the possibility of confrontation. She could not demand an explanation. She could not look him in the eyes and ask why. She had only these words, each one fixed, unchangeable, denying her the chance to question, to argue, to hear remorse beyond what he had chosen to write. She folded the letter back into its envelope, her hands unsteady. She held it against her chest as though it might offer warmth, but it was cold, a paper relic of betrayal. Tears threatened but would not fall. Her anger burned too brightly, mingling with grief until neither could be separated. She had lost her husband once to death. Now, through his confession, she lost him again, this time to the truth of who he had been all along. Margaret sat in the dim light, the letter heavy in her lap, and knew that nothing she had believed about her marriage would ever stand unshaken again. The man she had buried had written his own condemnation, and she was left to carry it alone. The evening passed in fragments, each moment dissolving into the next until Margaret no longer knew how long she had been sitting there with the letter pressed against her lap. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch and bend, filling every corner. The lamps flickered faintly, shadows moving along the walls, but she did not rise to adjust them. Her body felt heavy, her chest tight, as though the simple act of breathing had become a task she no longer wished to complete. The letter lay unfolded now, its words spread bare before her. She had read them until the ink itself seemed etched into her mind, until every phrase recited itself without effort. Asterisk, there is a child. I cannot deny it. Asterisk, a line repeated like a tolling bell, each echo striking deeper, reverberating through everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her family, her life. She had suspected, she had feared. But to see it in Thomas's own hand, written with deliberate care, stripped away the fragile layer of denial she had clung to. Her hands shook as she reached for the edge of bed, trying to steady herself. The room seemed to tilt, the air closing in too tightly. She pressed her palm to her chest, feeling her heart hammer with painful force. A sound escaped her, low and raw, more like a moan than a cry. It startled her, as if it had come from someone else, a stranger sharing the room. But then it came again, sharper this time, pulled from the deepest part of her grief. Margaret doubled forward, clutching the letter against her chest as sobs tore through her. The tears came hot, streaming down her face unchecked, falling on the fabric of her dress and the page itself. She wept not only for betrayal, but for the years she had believed in something that now felt like an illusion. Every memory was tainted, every anniversary, every kind word, every gift he had given her. Each now carried the weight of doubt. Had he thought of Anna then? Had he written her letters on the same nights he kissed Margaret goodnight? The grief was not the clean sorrow of death. It was jagged, layered with anger, humiliation, and confusion. She cried until her throat ached, until her body shook with the effort, until the pillow beneath her was damp and the shadows in the room had grown longer. At moments she wanted to scream, to tear the letter into pieces, to hurl it into the fire and watch the words curl and blacken. Yet some part of her could not. Destroying it would not erase what he had done. It would only silence the only confession he had left her. Her sobs broke into gasps, her body collapsing sideways onto the bed. She curled in on herself, the envelope still clutched tight in her hand. She thought of her children downstairs, unaware of the final proof she held. She thought of Anna alone in her rented room, carrying a child who had become the center of all this turmoil. The injustice of it seared her, how Thomas had left them all behind, leaving her to pick up the pieces of his choices. Hours passed, though Margaret barely felt them. The clock chimed somewhere in the house, its steady rhythm indifferent to her unraveling. When her tears finally slowed, exhaustion settled into her bones. Her body felt drained, her eyes swollen, her spirit hollowed. She lay staring at the ceiling, the letter on the pillow beside her, the words etched forever into her mind. The betrayal was no longer rumor, no longer suspicion. It was truth, confirmed by the man she had loved, the man she had buried. And as Margaret drifted into a restless sleep, She knew she would never again think of him as she once had. The grief of widowhood had become something else entirely. The grief of knowing she had shared her life with a man she could never fully claim as her own. Margaret waited until the house was still before calling her children into the parlor. The fire had been lit, though it burned low, casting uneven light across the room. The heavy drapes were drawn tight against the night, but the air inside felt colder than the weather outside. David arrived first, his face tight with impatience, his stance already defensive as though bracing for another argument. Clara followed, pale and hesitant, her eyes flickering nervously toward her mother. They sat together on the sofa, side by side but distant, their silence weighted with expectation. Margaret remained standing at first, her hands resting on the back of Thomas's old armchair. She had rehearsed her words in her mind, but now that the moment had come, her throat felt dry, her chest heavy. The envelope rested on the table before her. The folded letter inside like a stone she had been carrying since the day she found it. For a long moment, she could not bring herself to touch it. She looked instead at her children, seeing in their faces not only their father's features, but also the fear that his sins had already begun to stain them. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady though quiet. "I cannot protect you from this any longer. You must know what I have discovered. Not rumors, not whispers." His words. She sat at last, sliding the envelope across the polished wood. David reached for it first, his fingers rough with tension. He tore it open, unfolded the letter, and scanned the lines quickly. The muscles in his jaw twitched as he read. Clara leaned closer, her hand trembling as she touched the paper, her lips parting in disbelief at the first few sentences. Their eyes moved together across the page until the silence broke. Clara gasped softly, her voice cracking. He admitted it. David's hand slammed against the table. A child. He wrote it himself. He knew, and he lied to us every day. His voice shook with rage, and for a moment it seemed he might rip the paper in two. But he didn't. He dropped it back onto the table, the letter lying exposed for all of them to see. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, her composure fraying at the edges. "It is no longer a matter of rumor," he confessed. He wrote that he intended to provide for the child quietly, without bringing shame to us. But the shame is here regardless. It cannot be buried with him. Clara pressed her hands to her face, muffling a sob. "How could he? To us, to you?" Her voice was fragile, but the pain in it filled the room. David leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes hard. "We can't pretend anymore. We can't hide behind doubt. If Anna takes this to court, if she brings a child into a claim, no one will stand against her. Not with this." He jabbed a finger toward the letter, his anger sharp, but beneath it Margaret heard the echo of betrayal, the same wound she carried. Margaret lifted her chin, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I will not shield you from the truth. He was your father, but he was also a man who failed us. We cannot change what he did. What remains is how we face it." The three of them sat in silence, the letter lying between them like a verdict neither judge nor jury could alter. Clara wept quietly, her shoulders trembling. David stared at the fire, his expression locked in fury, the flames reflected in his eyes. Margaret watched them both, her heart torn, knowing she had given him no comfort, only truth. The parlor felt like a courtroom, the verdict spoken by the dead in his own hand. There were no closing arguments, no reprieve, only the evidence laid bare, and the family forced to sit in judgment of the man they had once trusted beyond question. And though no sentence would be passed, they all felt the punishment together, heavy and inescapable, as the fire burned low into ash. The letter remained on the parlor table long after Margaret and her children had risen from it, but its presence lingered in every corner of the house. The next evening, when Thomas's siblings and a few close relatives came to call, the quiet gathering soon took on the air of something harsher. Margaret had not intended to share the letter so soon, but David, unable to contain his fury, spoke bluntly. The room shifted then, heavy with outrage, suspicion, and disbelief. What began as murmurs swelled into a storm of divided voices. Thomas's elder brother, Charles, was the first to speak with finality. His voice was sharp, echoing through the room. "This Anna has no place here. She disrupted the funeral. She humiliated all of us. She is nothing more than a shameless opportunist. That letter," he jabbed a finger toward the table, "could have been written in a moment of weakness, a trick of words. I refuse to believe he meant it as truth." But his wife, Eleanor, sitting stiffly beside him, shook her head. Her voice was quieter, though firm. "It is his handwriting. We cannot pretend it isn't. If he confessed, then the child she carries may very well be his. And if so, that child is blood, whether we like it or not. He belongs to this family." The words ignited another round of protests. Clara, still pale from sleepless nights, whispered that she could not bear the thought her father's betrayal made flesh in another child. "It would feel like watching him walk back into this house wearing another face," she said, her voice trembling. "How could I accept that?" David, his arms crossed tightly, stood behind her chair, his expression hard. "We will not let her in," he declared. "Not Anna, not the child. She brings nothing but disgrace. If we give her even an inch, she will take the estate, our name, and every memory of father that still belongs to us." Eleanor pressed her lips together, her gaze moving from Clara's tear-stained face to David's clenched jaw. And what of the child's innocence? He did not choose how he was conceived. If Thomas is the father, then he is one of you, whether you wish it or not. To reject him is to deny what your father himself admitted. Another cousin, seated near the fire, added his voice cautiously. "Blood is blood. We can condemn Thomas's actions, but the child," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "The child is no more guilty than any of us were when born into this family. Do we punish him for his father's sins?" The room fractured further, voices rising, hands gesturing, the heat of argument filling the air. Some called for firmness, for disowning Anna outright, for denying her claim until a court forced them otherwise. Others urged caution, warning that cruelty would only deepen the scandal. Margaret sat silently through it all, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her heart ached at the sharp words flying back and forth, each one cutting in a different direction. She understood the fury. She felt it herself, burning in her chest whenever she thought of Anna's hand resting boldly on the coffin. Yet she also understood the quiet truth of Eleanor's words. The unborn child had no voice, no defense, only the inevitability of existence. To erase him would be to erase a truth already written into Thomas's blood. As the argument grew louder, Margaret rose slowly. The room fell into an uneasy hush at her movement. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with grief, but her voice, when she spoke, carried clearly. "Enough. You may quarrel among yourselves, but I will not preside over cruelty disguised as pride. The letter is proof enough. The child exists. Whether we welcome him or not, he will carry Thomas's blood. You may choose to turn your backs, but I will not." Her words silenced them, though not with agreement. David turned away, his jaw locked, while Clara buried her face in her hands. Charles muttered something under his breath, but Eleanor sat straighter, her eyes fixed on Margaret with a flicker of respect. The family had not reached unity that night. The house emptied with cold farewells, some departing in anger, others in quiet thought. But the fracture remained, sharp and visible, like a crack spreading through stone. Margaret stood alone in the parlor after they had gone, the letter still on the table, its truth unyielding. She knew then that Thomas's betrayal had not only wounded her marriage, but had split the family itself, leaving lines that might never be mended. The rain had fallen through the night, leaving the streets slick and shining under the pale morning light. Margaret walked with measured steps, her cloak pulled close against the chill, her gloved hands clutching a small parcel she had prepared with more hesitation than purpose. She had told no one where she was going, not David, whose anger had only deepened since the letter's revelation, nor Clara, whose grief had turned fragile and sharp. This journey belonged to her alone. The address had been scrawled on a slip of paper, given reluctantly by the lawyer who had seen Anna once before. Margaret had carried it in her pocket for days, until the silence in her own house had become unbearable. The building stood on a narrow lane by the river, its bricks darkened with damp, the windows clouded with age. Laundry hung limp on a line across the courtyard, swaying in the cold air. Margaret paused at the entrance, her stomach tightening. It was not pride that had brought her here, nor forgiveness. It was something quieter, heavier, the knowledge that the truth would not leave her, no matter how fiercely she tried to ignore it. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of mildew and boiled cabbage. The stairs groaned under her weight as she climbed to the second floor, the sound echoing in the silence of the building. At the end of the corridor, she found the door marked with a faded number. For a moment, she simply stood there, her breath uneven, before she raised her hand and knocked. There was a delay, a shuffling sound from within, then the door opened a fraction. Anna stood there, her hair unkempt, her face pale, a hand resting on the curve of her stomach as though to steady herself. Surprise flickered in her eyes when she saw Margaret, followed quickly by wariness. "Mrs. Hale," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Margaret inclined her head slightly, her own voice controlled. "May I come in?" Anna hesitated, then opened the door wider. The room inside was small and sparse, with little more than a narrow bed, a table with uneven legs, and a chair tucked into the corner. A kettle sat cold on the stove, beside a chipped cup and a loaf of bread gone stale at the edges. The air was close, carrying the faint scent of damp wood, and something sour, perhaps from the sickness of pregnancy. Anna lowered herself onto the bed, moving carefully, her breath shallow. She looked weaker than she had at the funeral, her cheeks hollowed, her skin drawn. "I've been unwell," she admitted, as though sensing Margaret's unspoken observation. "The doctor says it's nothing unusual, but some days I can hardly stand." She brushed a strand of hair from her face, her hand trembling slightly. Margaret placed the parcel on the table, without a word. Inside were a few things she had gathered from her own kitchen: bread, dried fruit, a small jar of broth. It was not charity in her mind, nor forgiveness, but necessity. She could not look at the girl and see only betrayal when weakness and suffering were written so clearly across her body. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint drip of water from somewhere outside. Margaret studied the room, the thin blanket folded at the foot of the bed, the pair of worn shoes by the door. This was the life Thomas had left hidden, the reality behind his promises. It was not romance or escape. It was struggle, bare and undeniable. Anna lifted her eyes at last, her voice soft but unyielding. "I never meant to take him from you. I only believed what he told me, that in time he would make room for us, that he would not let me face this alone." Margaret's lips pressed together, her anger rising and faltering all at once. She wanted to condemn, to remind Anna of the humiliation she had caused, the fracture she had forced into their lives. Yet as she looked at the girl, young, sick, clutching her stomach as though holding herself together, she felt the words catch in her throat. The man they both mourned had deceived them in different ways, binding them to the same grief. Margaret did not speak of forgiveness, nor did she offer comfort. Instead, she sat in the chair by the bed, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She would not turn away, not this time. The silence between them held no warmth, but it carried something else, an acknowledgement, a fragile recognition that they were bound by the same man's choices. Outside, the rain began again, steady against the glass, sealing them in that small room where betrayal, grief, and survival coexisted. Margaret stayed, watching Anna's labored breathing, the rise and fall of her hand over her stomach, and for the first time, she understood that her struggle was no longer with Anna, but with the memory of Thomas himself. The room was close, the air heavy with the scent of damp walls and boiled linen. Margaret sat rigid in the chair by Anna's bed, her cloak folded neatly over her lap, her gloved hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles ached. She had expected hostility to come easily, to let her anger shield her from any softness. But what she saw instead was not triumph in Anna's eyes. It was weariness. The young woman leaned against a thin pillow, her breathing uneven, her face drawn pale with strain. Tears welled at the corners of her eyes, not loud, not dramatic, but quiet, unrelenting, as though they had been waiting too long to fall. Margaret watched them slip down Anna's cheeks, tracing thin lines across skin far too young to have been shaped by this kind of suffering. She had thought once, in the first hours after the funeral, that Anna's appearance had been a kind of attack, an intrusion meant to shatter dignity. But here, In this bare room with its broken chair and meager provisions, there was no sense of conquest, no gloating, only a young woman left alone with the consequences of a man who had sworn to protect her. Anna wiped at her face quickly, embarrassed by her own weakness, though she could not hide it. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered, her voice raw. "I never wanted to take your place. I only wanted him to keep his promises. And now he's gone, and all I have are whispers following me through the streets." Her hand moved to her stomach, fingers splayed protectively. "And him, or her, whoever this little one becomes." The word struck Margaret deeper than she expected. She had spent weeks imagining Anna as an adversary, someone who had stolen pieces of Thomas's life. Yet in the tears on her face, Margaret saw not victory but burden, one that pressed just as heavily on Anna as betrayal pressed on herself. They were both left behind, both carrying the weight of Thomas's choices, both bound to a man who had given them half-truths and left them with silence. For a long time Margaret said nothing, her eyes fixed on the small window where rain streaked the glass. She thought of the nights she had waited for Thomas, believing him safe on business. She thought of the days Anna must have waited too, clutching the same hope, but in a different room, hidden from the world. They had both waited. They had both believed. And now they both mourned, not only the man, but the illusion of the man. Anna's tears continued quietly, and Margaret, though she did not reach out, felt her own chest tighten in recognition. Grief had a way of stripping people down to something bare, something equal. It made no distinction between wife and mistress, between legitimacy and scandal. It left only hollow rooms, sleepless nights, and the ache of promises unkept. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice low but steady. "He left us both with pieces we cannot fit together. You carry his child. I carry his memory. Neither of us asked for this, and neither of us can change it." Anna's eyes met hers then, red-rimmed and searching. For a moment Margaret saw not the girl who had shattered her world at the funeral, but another woman caught in the same storm, drowning in the same betrayal. The silence stretched, softer now, less hostile, though still heavy. They did not embrace. They did not forgive. But in that small, dim room, Margaret recognized that the tears sliding down Anna's cheeks were not weapons. They were the same kind that had soaked her own pillow night after night. They were grief's burden, shared though unwelcome, binding them together in a way neither could escape. When Margaret finally rose to leave, she did so quietly, her cloak gathered at her arm. She left the small parcel of food on the table, without a word. At the door, she paused, her eyes lingering one last time on Anna's bent figure, her hand resting on her stomach, as though cradling the future alone. Margaret's throat tightened, but she spoke nothing. She stepped into the rain, carrying with her the strange, bitter knowledge that she and Anna were no longer rivals. They were widows of the same man, each carrying grief in a different shape, but grief all the same. The winter had passed slowly, each week stretching into the next, as though time itself resisted moving forward. Margaret marked the days not by her own routines, but by the knowledge that somewhere across town, Anna's belly grew heavier, her steps slower. Rumors had persisted, of course. Neighbors whispering in markets, women lowering their voices at church pews, but the scandal that had erupted at the funeral had dulled into something more like a waiting game. The family knew what was coming, though none would admit aloud how it unsettled them. It was late in spring when word arrived. The messenger came in haste, breathless at Margaret's gate, stammering that Anna had gone into labor. Margaret stood frozen in the hall after the man had left, the air around her suddenly too still. She called for David and Clara, and within the hour they were on their way, joined reluctantly by Thomas's brother Charles and his wife Eleanor. It was not affection that drew them together, but obligation, a need to see with their own eyes the child who had fractured them. The small clinic stood at the edge of town, plain and functional, its whitewashed walls echoing faintly with cries and footsteps. When Margaret entered, the air smelled of disinfectant and boiled linen. She felt a chill despite the warmth of the season. Nurses moved briskly down the corridor, their voices clipped, their arms full of towels and basins. Margaret's heart beat unevenly as she followed, her children close behind, until they reached the small room where Anna lay. Anna was pale, her hair damp against her temples, her body trembling with exhaustion. She cradled a bundle wrapped in white cloth, the softest cry rising from within. Her eyes lifted when the family entered, wide with both fear and pride. For a moment no one spoke, the air charged with unspoken judgment, until the nurse adjusted the blanket and revealed the small, wrinkled face of a newborn. A boy, tiny, fragile, his fists clenching as though fighting the very air. Clara gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. David's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. Charles muttered under his breath, the words bitter, though Eleanor hushed him with a sharp glance. Margaret stepped forward, her body drawn not by reason but by something older, deeper. She looked down at the infant, the line of his brow, the small curve of his mouth, and she saw it. Thomas, written plainly in miniature, undeniable in blood. The truth settled like a stone in her stomach. There could be no denial, no hope of fabrication. This child was her husband's son. Anna's arms tightened protectively, but she spoke softly, almost pleading. His name is Samuel. Her voice cracked on a word, the syllables trembling with both love and fear. He deserves more than whispers. Please don't let him grow up hated. Margaret's throat closed. She wanted to recoil, to let the anger that had carried her for months speak in her place. But when she looked again at the child, his eyes blinking open, unfocused, searching, she felt her resolve shift. He had not asked to be born into scandal, nor had he chosen the lies that preceded him. He was only a boy, small and vulnerable, a life beginning in the midst of fractured kin. Behind her, David muttered that they should leave. Clara whispered that he was innocent, that it was not his fault. Charles's voice rose in protest, insisting the family should cut ties entirely. The room brimmed with division. The same fracture replayed yet again. But Margaret stood rooted, her gaze fixed on the boy who now represented all of it. Betrayal, grief, and the possibility of something more. She reached out, her hand trembling, and brushed the edge of the blanket. Anna flinched at first, then stilled, her eyes searching Margaret's face. Margaret did not smile, did not soften with words, but she let her fingers rest lightly on the fabric. It was not forgiveness, not acceptance in its fullest form, but it was a gesture, a recognition that Samuel was not just Anna's burden, nor just Thomas's mistake. He was family, whether they wished it or not. The silence stretched, broken only by the infant's soft cries. For the first time since the funeral, the family stood together in one room, divided but bound by the same undeniable truth. Samuel's arrival had not healed them, but it had forced them into a fragile truce, an uneasy acknowledgement that blood could not be ignored. As Margaret drew her hand back, she whispered to herself more than anyone else, "The child is here, and we will have to live with him." The words lingered, heavy, but also final. In the newborn's cries, she heard not triumph or shame, but the sound of life insisting itself into a family that had no choice but to reckon with it. The weeks after Samuel's birth passed with strange tension that hung over every conversation in the Hale household. The family went about their routines, but beneath the surface nothing was settled. David avoided the subject altogether, burying himself in work and refusing to mention Anna or her son. Clara, torn between anger and pity, lingered in silence most days, her thoughts written plainly in the dark circles beneath her eyes. Charles still spoke loudly against the child, insisting that the matter should be pressed in court to prevent any claim. Eleanor, steady as always, reminded them that denial would not erase what Thomas had written, nor the boy's resemblance that could not be ignored. Through it all, Margaret remained quiet, the weight of the decision pressing closer with each day. The will's formal reading had already been delayed once, the lawyer allowing them time to prepare, but the reprieve was only temporary. Soon, the estate would be settled, and silence would no longer protect them. Margaret knew that her husband's confession had changed everything. The letter was more than words of regret. It was acknowledgement, a truth he had meant her confront when he could no longer speak. She had read it so many times she could recite the lines in her sleep, the phrase about providing quietly etched into her mind. It was not enough. Provision in secret was another betrayal. Samuel deserved more than hidden coins and half-whispered promises. On a gray afternoon, Margaret called the family together again. They gathered in the parlor, the letter once more placed on the table. The fire burned low, its warmth barely reaching the edges of the room. David stood by the window, his face set like stone. Clara sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her expression uncertain. Charles leaned heavily on his cane, ready to object before words had even been spoken, while Eleanor's watchful eyes never left Margaret. Margaret remained standing. Her hands trembled slightly as she rested them on the back of her chair, but her voice, when she spoke, carried a calm authority. We cannot undo what Thomas did. We cannot erase Anna, nor the child she bore. But we can choose how his legacy will be written. I will not allow Samuel to grow up as if he were a stain upon this family. He is his father's son, and he will have his father's name. The room erupted at once. David's voice rose first, sharp with disbelief. You would put him beside us? Give him father's name as though he were one of us? He is not. He stopped, unable to finish, but his meaning filled the silence. Clara's eyes filled with tears, though her words were softer. Mother, think of what it means. Everywhere people will know. They will speak of father's betrayal each time they speak of the boy. Is that the legacy you want? Charles struck the floor with his cane. It is madness. To place him in the will is to open the gates to ruin. Once he has a claim, Anna will take everything she can. You will see it done, and all for a child who should never have been. Eleanor's voice cut through the noise. He exists. Pretending otherwise will not change that. She turned to Margaret, her expression firm. If you do this, it will be because you chose truth over pride, and it will be remembered. Margaret straightened, her face pale but resolute. This family has already been broken by secrets. I will not let another grow from silence. Samuel will not be denied his place. The will shall bear his name, and when he is grown, he will know that he was acknowledged, not hidden. The protestations continued, anger from David, outrage from Charles, worry from Clara, but Margaret did not waver. She looked at the fire, at the letter beside it, and felt the weight of her choice settle over her. This was not forgiveness for Thomas, nor even compassion for Anna. It was a decision for the child, innocent and unchosen, who had been born into turmoil. By placing him in a will, she would ensure that his life began not with denial but with recognition. At last the room quieted, the arguments exhausted. Margaret lifted the letter and held it in her hands. Thomas failed us, she said, her voice low but firm. But I will not fail the boy. His blood is ours, and so will his name be. The decision was made, and though dissent lingered in the eyes around her, no one spoke further. The fire crackled, the letter rustled in her grip, and in the silence that followed, Margaret felt the weight of legacy shift. Samuel will be written into the family, not as an intruder, but as a son who carried the truth that could no longer be buried. The morning was cool, the kind that pressed a faint mist against the ground and left the grass glistening underfoot. Margaret walked slowly up the cemetery path, her black cloak trailing behind her, the hem damp with dew. The familiar hush of the place wrapped around her, the rows of stones standing in silent order. Each one a marker of story ended but not forgotten. She had avoided this path for weeks, unable to bear the sight of the name carved in granite. But now she came willingly, though with a heart still heavy. Thomas's grave stood where she had left it. The soil settled now, the flowers long since withered. The stone itself was simple, dignified, as he had once requested. She paused before it, her hands folded at her waist, her eyes tracing the inscription. Husband, father, beloved. The words struck her differently now than they had when the stone was first placed. They no longer spoke only of comfort. They carried a weight of irony, of truths half-spoken and half-hidden. Yet still she stood there, unwilling to let anger alone define her presence. The letter rested in her bag, worn from the many times she had unfolded it, read it, held it like both a weapon and a wound. His confession, his admission to the child, had torn apart the foundation of the life they had shared. Yet she had also come to see that it was not the end of her dignity. Betrayal could not take that from her. She had endured. She had chosen. She had spoken aloud the decision to give Samuel his father's name. That choice was hers, not Thomas's, and it was her way of reclaiming the power he had thought to keep hidden. She lifted her eyes from the stone and let them move across the cemetery. A few mourners tended to other graves, bent figures placing flowers or brushing dirt from carved letters. Life continued even here, among the markers of its end. Margaret inhaled deeply, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. She thought of Anna in her small apartment, cradling Samuel, his tiny fists clenched as though demanding the world make space for him. She thought of the divided voices in her own family, the arguments, the pain. Yet through it all, she remembered the child's face, the undeniable reflection of Thomas in his features, and she felt her resolve deepen. Walking past Thomas's stone, she whispered, not to him but to herself, "You will not decide this legacy. I will." The word steadied her, giving shape to the strength she had carried silently for months. He had chosen silence in life, and his silence in death had been heavier still. But she would not let it dictate the future. She would not allow his betrayal to erase her place as mother, nor her children's right to stand unashamed, nor Samuel's right to be acknowledged as blood. Her steps carried her further down the path, away from the grave. She did not look back. For the first time since the funeral, she felt that she could walk forward without being pulled backward into the shadows of what Thomas had done. His stone would remain unchanging, a monument of both love and deceit. But she was not bound to it. She was bound to the living, to David and Clara, who still needed her strength, and to Samuel, who would one day need her protection from the whispers of others. The mist began to lift as she neared the gates, the sun breaking faintly through the clouds. Margaret tightened her cloak around her shoulders, her spine straight, her chin lifted. She was no longer only the widow of Thomas Hale. She was a keeper of dignity he had squandered, the guardian of a child he had tried to hide, and the voice that would ensure neither betrayal nor gossip would define what remained of their family's name. In that resolve, she found a steadiness she had thought lost, and with it, a path forward that was her own.